The gunshot that ended Winona Lewis's engagement echoed through the dusty streets of Fort Stanton, New Mexico territory, though the bullet itself lodged harmlessly in the saloon ceiling above her former fiancé's head. She had not been the one to fire it, but she might as well have been, given that her words had driven Thomas Crawford to such fury that he drew his pistol in the middle of the Golden Eagle Saloon on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878. What she had said was simple enough. She disagreed with his assertion that women should not voice opinions about territorial politics, especially when those politics involved grazing rights that affected her family's small ranch as much as anyone else's. Thomas had turned red as a summer sunset, slammed his whiskey glass down hard enough to crack it, and told her in front of 20 witnesses that he would not marry a woman who could not hold her tongue. Then he had pulled his gun, not to shoot her, but to fire a warning shot that he claimed was meant to remind her what happened to uppity women in the territory. The actual result was that the saloon owner banned him for a month, and Winona walked out with her head high, her heart hammering, and her future suddenly as uncertain as a spring storm. That had been 3 days ago, and already the gossip had spread through Fort Stanton like wildfire through dry grass. The other eligible men in town, already scarce given the rough ratio of males to females in the territory, seemed to have taken Thomas's rejection as a warning label. Winona Lewis was too outspoken, too opinionated, too unwilling to play the demure maiden that frontier society demanded of its women. Never mind that she could rope a steer, mend a fence, and had read more books than most of the men in town. Never mind that she had nursed her mother through consumption 2 years prior and had been running the Lewis family ranch alongside her aging father ever since. She stood now in the general store, her list of supplies in hand, aware of the whispers that followed her like a persistent shadow. Mrs. Henderson clutched her daughter closer as Winona passed, as if independent thinking might be contagious. Old Pete Martinez, who had known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, at least had the decency to look apologetic as he stepped aside to let her through. "Afternoon, Miss Lewis," the store clerk said, his tone carefully neutral. "What can I get for you today?" She rattled off her list efficiently. Flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition for the Winchester her father could barely lift any more, needles, thread, and lamp oil. The clerk assembled everything with mechanical precision, his eyes never quite meeting hers. When she paid, counting out the coins exactly, he mumbled something that might have been a thank you and immediately turned to serve the customer behind her before she had even gathered all her parcels. The July sun hit her like a physical force when she stepped back outside, the heat radiating off the hard, packed dirt of the main street. Fort Stanton sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, the Capitan Range rising to the west like a promise of cooler air that never quite made it down to the settlement. She loaded her supplies into the wagon, checking that the old mare was securely tied, when she heard the voice that had become all too familiar lately. "Winona Lewis, you should be ashamed of yourself." It was Mrs. Crawford, Thomas's mother, a woman whose spine seemed to have been replaced with an iron rod sometime before the Civil War. She approached with the deliberate steps of someone who believed God himself marched beside her. "My son offered you a good home, respectability, a future. And you threw it in his face with your unseemly behavior." Winona took a breath, counting to 5 the way her mother had taught her before responding to provocation. "Mrs. Crawford, your son pulled a gun in a public establishment because I expressed an opinion about grazing rights. I would suggest that his behavior was considerably more unseemly than mine. You contradicted him. In public, what man would tolerate such disrespect?" Mrs. Crawford's voice rose shrilly enough that several people on the street stopped to watch the confrontation. "A man who values honesty over obedience, perhaps," Winona said quietly. "A man who sees a wife as a partner rather than a possession." Mrs. Crawford's face flushed purple. "You will die alone and bitter, girl. Mark my words. No decent man will have you now." She turned with a swish of skirts and marched away, leaving Winona standing beside her wagon, very aware of the eyes still upon her. She climbed onto the wagon seat, released the brake, and guided the old mare out of town, taking the road that led north toward the ranch. The Lewis spread was small by territory standards, just enough acreage to run a modest herd of cattle and a few horses. Her father had claimed it in 1865, right after the war, bringing his young bride west to build something new away from the burned remnants of Tennessee. They had worked it together until her mother's death, and now it fell to Winona and her increasingly frail father to keep it going. The ranch house came into view as she crested the last rise, a simple adobe structure with a wooden addition her father had built when Winona was born. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant her father had managed to get the stove going for coffee at least. She worried about him more each day. At 63, Jacob Lewis moved like a man 20 years older, his joints stiff with rheumatism. His breathing labored from some injury he had sustained during the war and never properly healed. "How was town?" he called from the porch as she pulled the wagon up to the house. "About as welcoming as a rattlesnake in a bedroll," she replied, climbing down. "Mrs. Crawford felt compelled to inform me that I will die alone and bitter." Her father's weathered face creased with concern. "Winona, girl, maybe you should consider apologizing, begging Thomas to take me back, promising to keep my thoughts to myself for the rest of my natural life." She shook her head as she began unloading supplies. "Pa, I would rather die alone and honest than live as someone's muzzled dog." "I know, sweetheart, I know." He moved slowly down the steps to help her, though she took the heavier items to spare his back. "Your mother was the same way. Spoke her mind always, that woman. It is one of the reasons I loved her." They carried the supplies inside in companionable silence. The house was tidy but spare, containing only what was necessary and little that was not. Winona put away the food stores while her father settled heavily into his chair near the window where the light was good for reading. "I am going to check the north pasture fence," she said, changing from her town dress into the split riding skirt she wore for ranch work. "Jenkins mentioned last week that he had seen it looking poorly." "Take the rifle," her father said automatically. "Mountain lion tracks near the creek." She nodded, collected the Winchester and a canteen, and headed to the small corral where they kept the horses. Her mount was a sturdy paint gelding named Domino, bought 3 years ago from a mescalero trader passing through. He greeted her with a soft nicker, always eager for activity. The ride to the north pasture took about 40 minutes, following a trail that wound through scrub brush and scattered juniper trees. The land here was hard and beautiful in equal measure, unforgiving to those who did not respect it. Winona had learned its lessons early and well. She knew which plants indicated water nearby, which rock formations provided shade in the brutal summer heat, where to find shelter if a storm rolled in suddenly from the mountains. The fence was indeed in poor condition, several posts rotted through at the base, and the wire sagging badly. She dismounted and began assessing what would be needed for repairs. At least 2 new posts, probably more wire, definitely a full day's work. She was making mental notes when Domino suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. She froze, listening. "The mountains taught you to pay attention to your horse's warnings. For a long moment she heard nothing but the wind through the brush, and then it came, the sound of another horse moving fast and voices, angry voices carrying on the still air. Winona quickly led Domino into the cover of a rocky outcropping and pulled the Winchester from its scabbard. 3 riders came into view, moving along the creek bed below her position. She recognized 2 of them as hands from the Big T Ranch, the largest spread in the area, owned by a man named Thornton who had ambitions to control all the grazing land from here to the Capitan Mountains. The 3rd rider she did not know, but something about the way they had a rope around him and his hands tied to his saddle horn told her everything she needed to know about the situation. "You tell Thornton, this is what happens to squatters," one of the Big T men was saying. "We find you on open range again, we will not be so polite as to just escort you out." "I am not squatting," the bound man said, his voice deep and rough as gravel. "I have legal claim to that canyon, filed proper paperwork in Lincoln County Courthouse." "Canyon belongs to the Big T," the other ranch hand said. "Always has." "Then Thornton can show me his deed and we can settle this legal," the prisoner replied. "Until then I am staying put." The first man laughed, a sound without humor. "Mountain Man thinks he can challenge Mr. Thornton in court. That is rich." He reached over and shoved the bound man hard enough that he nearly fell from his horse. Winona had seen enough. She stood up from behind the rocks, rifle raised. "That is far enough, gentlemen." All 3 men jerked their horses to a halt, the Big T hands reaching for their guns before they registered that she already had them covered. "Miss Lewis," the first hand said, recognition dawning on his face, "this is not your concern." "You are on Lewis land," she said calmly, which was not entirely true but close enough that they would not want to argue the boundaries. "And I do not take kindly to seeing a man mistreated on my property. Cut him loose." "Now, miss, you do not want to get involved in this," the second hand said, his voice taking on a placating tone that made her teeth clench. "Just ranch business." "Cut him loose," she repeated, her voice hardening. "Or I can ride into Fort Stanton and explain to Sheriff Morrison how I found Big T hands assaulting a man on my land. I am certain Mr. Thornton would appreciate that kind of attention." The 2 men exchanged glances. The bound man sat very still, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Even from this distance, she could see he was built like the mountains he apparently called home, broad-shouldered and solid, with dark hair hanging past his collar and a beard that had not seen a barber in quite some time. "This is not over," the first hand finally said. He pulled a knife and cut the rope binding the mountain man to his saddle, though he left his hands tied. "Mr. Thornton does not forget." "I am sure he does not," Winona said evenly. "Give him my regards." The 2 Big T men wheeled their horses and rode off at a gallop, leaving a trail of dust and muttered curses. Winona waited until they were well out of sight before lowering the rifle and approaching the remaining rider. Up close, he was even larger than she had initially thought, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn buckskin shirt. His face was weathered and tanned, with eyes the color of a storm over the mountains. Those eyes studied her with the same careful assessment she was giving him. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said finally. "I have been called both," she replied, reaching up to cut the ropes binding his wrists, though usually not in the same breath. "Winona Lewis." "Caleb Young," he said, rubbing feeling back into his hands. "And I am obliged for the assistance, Miss Lewis, though you may have just bought yourself some trouble with the Big T." "The Big T and I were already not on the best of terms," she said. "Thornton wants my land almost as much as he apparently wants yours. What canyon are they disputing?" Little Creek Canyon, about 8 miles northwest of here. He gestured toward the mountains. Good water year-round, sheltered from the worst weather. I filed claim to it 6 months ago, built a cabin, been living there since. And Thornton says it belongs to him. Thornton says everything belongs to him if he looks at it long enough. Caleb's voice was dry. But I have the paperwork. Problem is, paperwork does not mean much when a man has 30 hired hands willing to enforce his version of property rights. Winona nodded slowly, recognizing the situation all too well. You should file a complaint with Sheriff Morrison. I did. He suggested I might want to reconsider my claim. Said it was not worth dying over. Caleb gathered his reins, preparing to leave. I appreciate what you did, Miss Lewis, but I would advise you to stay clear of this situation. Thornton plays rough. Mr. Young, she said, stopping him before he could ride off. When was the last time you had a proper meal? He looked surprised by the question. Why do you ask? Because you look half-starved. You have been manhandled by thugs, and my father raised me to offer hospitality to those who need it. Our ranch is just over that ridge. It is not much, but we have food and coffee, and you can water your horse properly. For a moment she thought he would refuse. Pride was written all over his face, the kind of pride that came from surviving on your own terms in hard country. But finally he nodded. That is kind of you, I accept. They rode back to the ranch together, Caleb keeping pace beside her on a rangy buckskin stallion that looked as independent-minded as its owner. She found herself curious about this mountain man who stood up to land grabbers and spoke with a quiet courtesy that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. How long have you been in the territory? She asked. 3 years, give or take. Came down from Colorado after some trouble with mining companies up there. Seems I have a talent for finding myself on the wrong side of powerful men. He said it without particular emotion, just stating a fact. What kind of trouble? The kind where you object to a company dumping poison into the creek that supplies drinking water for 6 families, and the company decides you are bad for business. He glanced at her. I assume you know something about being on the wrong side of local opinion, given what you did back there. She was not sure what he meant at first, then realized he was talking about her intervention. I cannot abide bullies. Neither can I. It is an expensive principle to hold. They crested the ridge and the ranch came into view. Her father was on the porch, and his posture went tense when he saw she was not alone. Winona waved to signal all was well, and Jacob relaxed slightly but kept his hand near the rifle propped beside the door. Pa, this is Caleb Young, she called as they approached. The big T was giving him trouble up near the north fence. I offered him a meal. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied their guest, taking in the worn buckskins, the powerful build, the way Caleb sat his horse like a man accustomed to living in the saddle. But Jacob Lewis had not survived the war and 20 years on the frontier without learning to read character, and whatever he saw in Caleb's steady gaze seemed to satisfy him. Any man the big T troubles is welcome at my table, Jacob said. Water your horse at the trough there, Mr. Young. Winona, if you would get the stew heated up. They settled into the simple ritual of frontier hospitality. Caleb tended to his horse with the careful attention of someone who depended on his mount for survival, then washed up at the pump outside before coming into the house. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, and the main room seemed to shrink with his presence in it. Over bowls of venison stew and thick slices of bread, the conversation ranged across safer topics. The weather, the quality of grass this year, the rumor that the railroad might eventually push a spur line toward Fort Stanton. Jacob clearly approved of their guest, engaging him in a discussion of the best routes through the Capitan Mountains that revealed Caleb's extensive knowledge of the region. You know this country better than most men who have lived here for decades, Jacob observed. I make it my business to know the land, Caleb said. Your life can depend on understanding where the water is, which passes are safe in winter, where to find game when supplies run low. The mountains do not forgive ignorance. Truth in that, Jacob agreed. He studied Caleb for a long moment. My daughter tells me you filed legal claim to Little Creek Canyon. You planning to ranch it? Some. Mostly I trap and hunt, sell furs and meat to the fort and the reservation. The canyon gives me a base, good shelter, reliable water. I am not looking to build an empire, Mr. Lewis. Just want a place to live in peace. Peace is in short supply when men like Thornton are involved. Jacob's expression darkened. He has been pressuring me to sell this place for 2 years now. Started with decent offers, but they have gotten progressively less friendly. Winona set down her spoon with more force than necessary. He sent men to accidentally spook our cattle last month. We lost 6 head into the ravine before we could get them turned around. Caleb's jaw tightened. Sheriff, do anything. Sheriff suggested we should consider selling before something worse happened, Jacob said bitterly. Thornton has half the county officials in his pocket, one way or another. Money talks loud in the territory. Not the only thing that talks, Caleb said quietly. A man stands up for his rights long enough, loud enough. Sometimes that means something too. Speaking of standing up for rights, Jacob said, glancing at his daughter with obvious affection, Winona has some experience in that department. Got herself unmarried 3 days ago for the crime of having opinions. Pa! Winona felt heat rise to her face. Caleb's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that might have been interest. That's so. Thomas Crawford took offense at my thoughts on grazing rights, she said curtly. He made his feelings clear by firing his gun in the saloon and announcing he would not marry an outspoken woman. Thomas Crawford, Caleb repeated. Skinny fellow, works as a clerk at the land office. That is him. Met him when I filed my claim. Struck me as the type who mistakes volume for authority. Caleb leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Any man who needs a gun to win an argument with a woman is no man at all to my thinking. That is a minority opinion in Fort Stanton, Winona said dryly. Seems to me the majority is wrong about a fair number of things. He met her eyes directly when he said it, and she felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. I have always held that people should speak their minds. How else are you supposed to know what they are really thinking? All this dancing around the truth, trying to figure out what someone actually means under all the polite nonsense, it is exhausting. Exactly. The word burst out of her with more force than she intended. I told Thomas the same thing. If we cannot be honest with each other about simple matters like politics and land use, how are we supposed to build a life together? You cannot, Caleb said simply. Honesty is the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, you are just building on sand. Jacob looked between the two of them with an expression Winona could not quite read. Mr. Young, if you are amenable, I would like to make you a proposition. I am listening. The north fence is in bad shape, needs at least a day of hard work to set it right. I do not have the back for it anymore, and while Winona is more than capable, it is really a 2-person job. You help us get that fence mended, and I will pay you fair wages plus meals for as long as the work takes. Caleb considered this. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Lewis, but I cannot take pay for helping neighbors. I would be glad to assist with the fence, though. Call it repayment for Miss Lewis running off those big tea hands before they could do worse than rough me up. Then stay for dinner and breakfast at least, Jacob insisted. You can bed down in the barn, it is clean and the hay is fresh. That I will accept, Caleb agreed. Thank you. They talked until the light faded from the windows, the conversation flowing easily among the three of them. Winona found herself watching Caleb when he was not looking, noticing the way his hands moved when he talked, strong and sure but surprisingly graceful. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without overwhelming it, solid and dependable as bedrock. When full darkness fell, she showed him out to the barn, carrying a lantern to light the way. The night air was cool and sweet, a relief after the day's heat, and overhead the stars blazed in profusion against the black sky. "You have a good setup here," Caleb said, looking around the barn. "Well-maintained, organized, that speaks to character." "My father built most of it himself," she said, setting the lantern on a hook. "I have tried to keep it up to his standards. There are extra blankets in that chest, and help yourself to water from the barrel." "Miss Lewis," he said as she turned to go, "what you did today, standing up to those men, that took courage. I want you to know I recognize that." She paused in the doorway. "You would have done the same if our positions were reversed." "Maybe, but that does not make what you did any less brave." He moved closer, his face half shadowed in the lantern light. "This business with your former fiancé, him saying you are too outspoken. For what it is worth, I think any man who wants a silent woman should just get himself a dog. A wife should be a partner, someone who challenges you and makes you think. Someone who is not afraid to tell you when you are wrong or when you are right. Speaking your mind is not a flaw, Miss Lewis. It is a virtue." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had grown so accustomed to being criticized for her directness that genuine approval felt almost foreign. "Thank you, Mr. Young. That means more than you might think. Call me Caleb, please. We are neighbors, after all, if you count 8 miles as neighboring distance." "In the territory, 8 miles definitely counts as neighbors," she smiled. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Winona." She walked back to the house aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. Her father was still up, sitting by the lamp with a book, but she suspected he had not turned a single page since she left. "He seems like a good man," Jacob said without preamble. "He does," she agreed cautiously. "Strong, capable, respectful. The kind of man who stands up for what he believes in. Pa, we just met him today. I know character when I see it, girl. I knew your mother was the woman I would marry about 5 minutes after meeting her. Sometimes things are just clear." He set down his book and looked at her directly. "I am not trying to marry you off, Winona. Lord knows you have had enough of that pressure lately. I am just saying, keep an open mind. Good men are scarce out here, and ones who appreciate a woman speaking her mind are scarcer still." She kissed his weathered cheek. "I will keep an open mind. Now get some sleep. You are going to want to supervise the fence work tomorrow, which means an early start." She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. The wind through the cottonwoods near the creek, the occasional shuffle and snort from the horses in the corral, a coyote singing somewhere out on the range. And beneath it all, the awareness that in the barn not 50 yards away, Caleb Young was probably lying awake too, thinking thoughts she could not know but desperately wanted to understand. Morning came with roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing. Winona dressed quickly and started breakfast, frying salt pork and eggs while her father moved slowly through his morning routine. She was just pulling biscuits from the oven when Caleb knocked at the door, hat in hand. "Morning," he said. "Something smells mighty good." They ate breakfast as the sun climbed over the eastern ridges, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The meal was simple but abundant, and Caleb ate with the appetite of a man accustomed to hard physical labor. Afterward, they loaded fence posts and wire into the wagon and headed out to the north pasture. Jacob riding along to provide direction even if he could not help with the heavy lifting. Working alongside, Caleb proved to be an education in efficiency. He moved with the economy of motion that came from years of labor, never wasting energy but accomplishing an enormous amount of work. He also, Winona discovered, had a gift for making her laugh. His observations about the world were delivered in a bone-dry tone that caught her off guard, and soon she found herself looking forward to his next comment. "This post has rotted through because whoever said it originally did not treat the base properly," he observed, pulling the remnant from the ground. "See how the wood is soft here. Should have been sealed with tar or pine pitch before planting." "I think my father set these when we first claimed the land," Winona said. "He probably did the best he could with what he had." "No criticism intended," Caleb assured her. "We all learn as we go. I built a cabin in Colorado that leaked like a sieve the first winter. Had to practically rebuild the whole roof before I figured out proper shingling." They worked through the morning heat, pausing occasionally to drink from the canteen and rest in what shade they could find. Jacob had dozed off in the wagon, his hat over his face, leaving Winona and Caleb essentially alone. "Can I ask you something?" Winona said as they manhandled a new post into position. "Anything." "Why Little Creek Canyon specifically? The territory is full of good land." "Why fight Thornton for that particular piece?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, tamping dirt around the post base with methodical strikes. "You ever find a place that just feels right, like the land itself is welcoming you home?" She thought of the ranch, the view from the ridge at sunset, the sound of the creek running full after spring melt. "Yes, I know exactly what you mean. That is Little Creek Canyon for me. First time I rode into it, something just settled in my chest. Like I had been looking for it my whole life without knowing. The way the light comes through in the morning, the way the wind sounds in the pines, the cold, clear water running year-round. It is not the biggest canyon or the richest land, but it is mine. In my heart, if not yet an undisputed fact." "Then you cannot give it up," she said firmly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt the intensity of that gaze all the way to her bones. "No, I cannot. Even if the smart thing would be to find someplace else, someplace that would not put me at odds with the biggest rancher in the county. Some things are worth fighting for. Some people understand that principle and some do not," she said. "Thomas never did. He could not understand why I would not just smile and nod and keep my thoughts to myself. He saw it as stubbornness rather than integrity." "His loss," Caleb said bluntly. "Though I will admit, when your father mentioned it last night, my first thought was gratitude. Gratitude. That you were not married to some fool who did not appreciate you." He returned his attention to the fence post, but not before she saw color rise in his tanned cheeks. "Hold this steady while I attach the wire." They worked in charged silence for several minutes, both acutely aware of what had just been said and not said. Winona's heart was beating faster than the physical labor warranted, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the wire taut for him to fasten. "There is a dance in Fort Stanton next Saturday," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could think better of them. "To celebrate the founding anniversary. Nothing fancy, just music and refreshments in the church hall." Caleb's hand stilled on the wire. "I am not much for social gatherings, especially not in towns where I am currently in dispute with the most powerful man around." "I understand." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "It was just a thought." "However," he continued, "if a certain outspoken young woman needed an escort to such an event, I would consider it my duty to provide protection from disapproving townfolk and spurned former fiancés." Joy bubbled up in her chest. That certain young woman would appreciate such protection. Then consider it arranged." He smiled at her, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Though I should warn you, I dance about as well as a bear on ice skates. I will take my chances." Jacob woke as they were finishing the last section of fence, stretching and groaning as his joints protested the nap in the wagon. "Looking good," he called. "Better than I could have hoped. You do fine work, Mr. Young." "Caleb," the mountain man corrected gently, "and it is nothing. Good honest labor." They returned to the ranch for a late lunch, and Winona noticed her father watching her and Caleb with barely concealed satisfaction. After the meal, Caleb prepared to leave, gathering his gear from the barn while his buckskin stamped impatiently. "You are welcome here any time," Jacob said, shaking his hand. "And I mean that. If Thornton gives you more trouble, you come straight here. We may not have 30 hired guns, but we have right on our side, and that counts for something." "I appreciate that, sir." Caleb turned to Winona, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "I will come by Saturday morning to escort you to town, if that suits you." "It suits me fine," she managed. She watched him ride away, following the trail that would take him northwest toward the mountains and his disputed canyon. Even after he disappeared from view, she stood there, awareness settling over her that something fundamental had shifted in her world. The week that followed passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety. Word had gotten around Fort Stanton that Winona had interfered with Big T business, and the reactions ranged from admiration to censure. Some of the smaller ranchers quietly expressed approval, having suffered their own troubles with Thornton's expansionist ambitions. Others, particularly those socially ambitious women who saw alliance with the Big T as desirable, made their disapproval clear. Mrs. Henderson actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. The preacher's wife made pointed comments about the proper role of women during Sunday services. Even old Pete Martinez, usually an ally, cautioned her that Thornton was not a man to cross lightly. Thomas Crawford, for his part, seemed torn between outrage that she had moved on so quickly and relief that he was no longer obligated to marry such a difficult woman. He made a point of courting Sarah Jenkins, the banker's daughter, with ostentatious public displays clearly designed to show Winona what she was missing. The effect was rather spoiled by Sarah's obvious discomfort with his aggressive attention. Through it all, Winona found herself thinking about Caleb. The way he had stood up for himself against the Big T, his quiet assertion that speaking your mind was a virtue, not a flaw. The solid, dependable strength he radiated, like the mountains themselves, had shaped him from their own substance. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, cool and clear with a breeze that carried the scent of pine from the high country. Winona dressed with care, choosing her best dress, a dark blue cotton with ivory lace at the collar that her mother had helped her make 3 years ago. She arranged her hair in a simple bun, securing it with the tortoiseshell combs her father had given her for her 21st birthday. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Jacob said when she emerged. "Just like your mother." Caleb arrived precisely at 10, riding the buckskin and leading a gentle mare for Winona to ride. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing clean dark trousers and a white shirt, his hair trimmed and beard neatly groomed. He still looked like a mountain man, but a mountain man going courting. "Miss Lewis," he said, swinging down from his horse, "you look lovely." "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." The ride to Fort Stanton took just over an hour, and they spent it talking easily about everything and nothing. He told her about tracking a mountain lion that had been bothering his horses, making the story funny rather than frightening. She described her father's latest attempt to read without his spectacles, which he stubbornly refused to admit he needed. "He is proud," Caleb observed. Admitting his eyes are failing is admitting he is getting older. That is hard for a man who has been strong all his life. I know. I just worry about him. He is all the family I have left. Then we will have to make sure he is around for a good long while yet. The casual way he said we, including himself in her future, sent warmth spreading through her chest. Fort Stanton was bustling when they arrived, horses and wagons crowding the main street. The church hall had been decorated with bunting and wildflowers, and someone had set up a small stage for the musicians. Winona felt the familiar weight of stairs as she and Caleb entered together, conversations pausing mid-sentence as people took note of her escort. "Let them look," Caleb murmured, his hand warm on the small of her back. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." Thomas Crawford stood near the refreshment table, Sarah Jenkins trapped at his side looking desperate for escape. His face went dark red when he saw Winona with Caleb, and he said something sharp to Sarah that made the girl flinch. "Your former beau appears distressed," Caleb observed mildly. "My former mistake appears to be making his current mistake miserable," Winona corrected. "Poor Sarah. She is far too nice to know how to get rid of him. Should we rescue her?" Before Winona could answer, Sarah herself solved the problem by suddenly announcing in a voice pitched to Carrie that she needed to help her mother with something and fleeing across the room. Thomas was left standing alone, glowering at anyone who looked his way. The music started, a lively fiddle tune that got people moving onto the makeshift dance floor. Caleb held out his hand. "Shall we? Fair warning, I meant what I said about dancing like a bear." He was not nearly as bad as advertised. His steps were a bit heavy, and he lacked the smooth polish that came from regular practice, but he was steady and confident, and he held her like she was something precious. They moved together across the floor, and Winona found she did not care one bit about technical proficiency. This felt right in a way dancing with Thomas never had. "You are staring," he said, amusement in his voice. "You are worth staring at." "Bold words, Miss Lewis." "I thought you appreciated bold women." "I do indeed." He pulled her slightly closer, pushing the boundaries of propriety but not quite crossing them. "I appreciate this particular bold woman especially." They danced 3 more dances before taking a break for refreshments. The punch was overly sweet and the cookies were dry, but Winona barely noticed, too focused on the man beside her and the way he made her feel. Seen, valued, respected. Not everyone was pleased by their obvious connection. "Mrs. Crawford positioned herself directly in their path, her expression sour as old milk. "Miss Lewis, I see you have found yourself another man willing to tolerate your unseemly behavior." Before Winona could respond, Caleb stepped forward slightly, his tone polite but firm. "Madam, I have found myself a woman of intelligence, courage, and integrity. If you find those qualities unseemly, I can only feel sorry for you." Mrs. Crawford's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "Well, I never." "That much is evident," Caleb agreed gravely, then guided Winona away before the older woman could recover her powers of speech. Winona was struggling not to laugh. "That was possibly the most polite devastation I have ever witnessed. I meant every word. You are intelligent, courageous, and possessed of more integrity than half this town combined." He found them a quieter corner, away from the worst of the crowd. "Winona, I know we have only known each other a week, but I am not a man who plays games or hides what he is thinking. I need you to know that my intentions toward you are serious." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "How serious?" "The kind that involves me riding 8 miles regularly to call on you proper. The kind that involves me asking your father for permission to court you officially. The kind that, if you are amenable, leads to me asking you to be my wife somewhere down the road." He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "But only if that is what you want. I will not push and I will not demand. You deserve to choose your own path." "I choose you," she said simply. "I knew at the moment you said speaking your mind was a virtue. Thomas wanted me to be smaller, quieter, less myself. You make me feel like I can be exactly who I am." "You should never be anything else," he said fiercely. "Promise me, Winona. Whatever happens between us, you will always speak your mind. Even if it is to tell me I am being a fool, especially if it is to tell me that. I promise. And you have to promise the same. Honesty between us always." "Always," he agreed. The dance continued around them, but they stayed in their quiet corner, talking about the future they might build together. Caleb spoke of expanding his trapping operation, maybe running a few cattle in the canyon. Winona described her hopes for the ranch, improving the herd quality, possibly planting an orchard near the creek. "We could combine operations," he said thoughtfully. "Your ranch and my canyon, they are close enough that we could work both properties. Your father would always have a home with us, of course." "Us." She tested the word, liking the sound of it. "Yes, I think I could get used to us." They were so absorbed in each other that they did not notice Thornton's arrival until his voice cut through the ambient noise of the party. "Well, well, if it is not the mountain man squatting on my land and the troublesome Miss Lewis." Thornton was a large man gone soft around the middle, his expensive clothes and gold watch chain marking him as someone who believed money equaled worth. Two of his men flanked him, including one of the hands Winona had run off the week before. "Mr. Thornton," Caleb said evenly, straightening to his full height, which put him a good 4 inches taller than the rancher. "I am not squatting. I have legal claim properly filed and registered." "That claim is disputed," Thornton said dismissively. "The land office made an error. That canyon has been part of the Big T Range for 10 years. Then you will have no trouble proving that in court. I look forward to seeing your documentation." Caleb's voice was calm, but Winona could feel the tension in him, coiled and ready. Thornton's face reddened. "You are making a mistake, boy. I offered you money to walk away. That offer is about to expire. I am not interested in your money. I am interested in the law being followed correctly." "The law," Thornton sneered. "The law is what men like me say it is in this territory. The sooner you understand that, the longer you are likely to live." Several nearby conversations had stopped, people turning to watch the confrontation. The musicians played on, unaware of the drama unfolding. "Is that a threat, Mr. Thornton?" Sheriff Morrison had appeared from somewhere in the crowd, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Because making threats at a public gathering would be something I would have to take official notice of." Thornton shot the sheriff an irritated glance. "No threat, Morrison. Just friendly advice to a newcomer who does not understand how things work around here." "Seems to me Mr. Young understands just fine," the sheriff said. "He filed legal claim. He is living on that claim, and unless you can prove otherwise in a court of law, he has every right to stay there." Morrison's expression made it clear this was not his personal opinion but the legal reality he was bound to uphold. "We will see about that," Thornton said. He turned his cold gaze on Winona. "And you, Miss Lewis, you cost me 2 days' work running off my men. I do not forget debts." "Neither do I," Winona said, lifting her chin. "So we are even, considering your men cost me 6 head of cattle last month." Thornton's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have no proof of that." "I have hoofprints and witnesses who saw Big T riders in the area at the time. But you are right, I have no proof. Just like you have no proof that Little Creek Canyon belongs to you." For a moment, Winona thought Thornton might actually strike her, but Caleb moved between them with deceptive casualness, his presence a clear warning. "This is a party, Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Morrison said firmly. "Maybe you should get some air, cool down a bit." Thornton stood there, visibly wrestling with his temper, then turned and stalked out with his men trailing behind. The conversations that had paused resumed with increased energy, everyone eager to discuss the confrontation they had witnessed. "That went well," Caleb said dryly. "You have a talent for understatement," Winona replied, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. Sheriff Morrison approached them, his expression serious. "Mr. Young, Miss Lewis, I meant what I said about the law, but I have to be honest with you both. Thornton has a lot of influence and he does not like losing. Watch yourselves." "We will, Sheriff," Caleb promised. "Thank you for intervening." The party continued, but the mood had shifted. People were divided between those who admired the stand Caleb and Winona had taken, and those who thought they were fools to antagonize Thornton. Winona found herself the subject of intense scrutiny, some approving, much of it critical. "We should probably go," she said quietly to Caleb, "before things get more uncomfortable." He nodded, and they made their excuses, collecting their horses and riding out of Fort Stanton as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Neither spoke for the first mile, processing what had happened. "I am sorry," Caleb finally said. "I brought trouble to your door by association." "You did not bring anything I was not already carrying," she countered. "Thornton was targeting my ranch long before I met you. If anything, we are stronger together than apart. Two targets are harder to intimidate than one." "You really mean that, about being together?" "Every word." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. "I meant what I said at the dance, Caleb. I choose you, I choose us." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with surprising gentleness. "Then, I am the luckiest man in the territory." They rode together back to the Lewis ranch, where Jacob was waiting on the porch, concern written on his weathered face. "Saw riders heading toward your canyon about an hour ago," he told Caleb without preamble. "Big T men looked like, 6 or 7 of them." Caleb's expression went hard. "They are going after my cabin." "Probably," Jacob agreed. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I am going to defend my property." He turned to Winona. "I need to go now." "Not alone, you are not." She was already dismounting, heading for the house. "Pa, get the rifles ready. We are riding to Little Creek Canyon." "Winona, no," Caleb protested. "This could turn violent." "I cannot ask you to risk yourself." "You are not asking. I am offering. And before you waste breath arguing, remember that I am an excellent shot. I know how to handle myself, and you told me to always speak my mind." "Well, my mind says we are coming with you." Jacob was already loading rifles and gathering ammunition. "The girl is right. You are going to need help, and we are neighbors. That means something out here." Caleb looked between them, clearly torn between gratitude and concern, but finally he nodded. "Then we ride fast. If they are planning to burn me out, we do not have much time." They mounted up and rode hard for Little Creek Canyon, pushing the horses as fast as the rough terrain would allow. The sun was low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. Winona's rifle bounced against her back, and her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. The canyon came into view as they crested a ridge, and Winona caught her first glimpse of what Caleb had been fighting for. It was beautiful, a narrow valley carved by centuries of water flow, with tall pines rising on either side and a creek running crystal clear down the middle. And there, in a sheltered spot near the water, stood a small but well-built cabin. Smoke was rising from behind the cabin, and they could see men moving around the structure. Caleb made a sound low in his throat, half growl, half anguish, and spurred his horse forward. Wait, Jacob called, but Caleb was already racing down the slope, and there was nothing to do but follow. They came thundering into the canyon, and the big T men looked up in surprise. There were 6 of them, as Jacob had estimated, and they had clearly been in the process of setting fire to the woodpile stacked behind the cabin. One man held a burning torch, frozen in the act of touching it to the kindling. "Get away from my property." Caleb's voice boomed across the canyon like thunder. The big T men spread out, hands moving toward their guns. The one with the torch, emboldened by numbers, sneered. "Make us squatter. You are on private property," Jacob called out, his rifle leveled. "And you were witness to attempting arson." "The sheriff will hear about this." "Sheriff is not here," another man said, "and it is 6 against 3. I would say the odds are in our favor." "Can you all do mathematics that well?" a new voice asked from the tree line. Pete Martinez emerged on horseback, rifle in hand. "Because I count 4 now." One by one, more riders appeared. Small ranchers and homesteaders, people who had suffered under Thornton's expanding ambitions. Jenkins from the neighboring spread. Young Tom Wilson, barely 20, whose father had lost land to big T pressure. Sarah's father, the banker, who apparently had his own grievances. Within minutes, a dozen armed men and 3 women had arrayed themselves in support of Caleb. The big T hands looked at each other, clearly recalculating their position. The man with the torch slowly lowered it. "This is not over," he said, but it came out weak, lacking conviction. "Yes, it is," Pete said firmly. "You tell Thornton that we are done letting him run roughshod over this county. Young has legal claim to this canyon, and we will stand witness to that in any court of law. You come back here, you will be trespassing, and we will defend our neighbor's rights." The big T men mounted their horses and rode out, leaving the torch guttering in the dirt. Caleb dismounted slowly, staring at the assembled group with something like wonder on his face. "I do not know what to say," he managed. "Say you will keep fighting for what is right," Pete replied. "Say you will stand with us the way we are standing with you." "I will. You have my word." The group dispersed gradually as darkness fell, people heading home to their own ranches and families. But Pete pulled Winona aside before leaving. "That was a good thing you did, getting people together," he said quietly. "I just sent a few messages. Let people know what was happening," she protested. "You did more than that. You reminded folks that we are stronger together. That we do not have to accept Thornton's version of how things should be." He glanced at Caleb, who was inspecting his cabin for damage. "He is a good man. Treat him well." "I intend to." Eventually, only Caleb, Winona, and Jacob remained. Jacob diplomatically announced he would check the perimeter, leaving the younger 2 alone. "I cannot believe you organized that," Caleb said, taking her hands. "How did you even have time?" "I sent my father to spread the word while I was getting ready for the dance. I had a feeling Thornton would not let things lie, and I thought you might need backup." She looked up at him in the gathering darkness. "Was I wrong to interfere?" "Wrong. Winona, you may have saved my life, certainly saved my home." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "You are amazing, do you know that? I just did what needed doing." "No, you did what most people would not have the courage to do. You stood up and organized resistance. You turned the tide." He drew back enough to look at her face. "I love you. I know it is too soon and I should wait and court you properly for months before saying such things, but I cannot help it. I love you." "It is not too soon," she whispered. "I love you too. I think I have since the moment you said speaking your mind was a virtue." He kissed her then, soft and sweet at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck. It was everything a first kiss should be, full of promise and passion and the thrilling certainty that this was exactly right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." "Yes, I am serious. I know we have only known each other a week, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me, Winona, be my wife and my partner. Speak your mind to me for the rest of our lives." "Yes," she said again, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." Jacob chose that moment to return, one look at their faces telling him everything he needed to know. "I assume congratulations are in order." She said yes, Caleb told him, joy making him look years younger. Of course she did. She is her mother's daughter, and her mother knew a good man when she found one. Jacob shook Caleb's hand firmly. "Welcome to the family, son. Now let us get back to the ranch before it is full dark. We can celebrate properly with something stronger than water." The ride back was filled with planning and laughter, the earlier tension transformed into exhilaration. They would marry as soon as possible, they decided. No point in waiting when they were both certain. They would combine the ranch and the canyon into one operation, building a life that honored both properties. Jacob would live with them, of course, and they would care for him as he aged. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the Fort Stanton church, with half the county in attendance. Winona wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and carried wildflowers picked from the canyon that was now her home too. Caleb wore his best clothes and looked at her like she was the sun and moon combined. Thomas Crawford did not attend, but Sarah Jenkins did, sitting with her parents and looking genuinely happy for Winona's good fortune. Mrs. Crawford stayed away, but several other prominent families came, a subtle shift in social dynamics that acknowledged Caleb and Winona's growing influence. Even Sheriff Morrison attended, giving Winona a nod of approval as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Winona felt tears prick her eyes as Caleb took her hands, his grip warm and strong and certain. They spoke their vows clearly, promises of love and honor and partnership. When Caleb vowed to cherish her voice and her opinions as much as her heart, several women in the congregation wiped their eyes. When Winona promised to stand beside him in all things, for better or worse, the small ranchers who had stood with them at the canyon nodded approvingly. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and Caleb did, thoroughly enough to make some of the older ladies fan themselves and giggle. The celebration afterward was held at the Lewis Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwoods and enough food to feed everyone twice over. Pete Martinez had brought his fiddle, and soon there was dancing, the same kind of simple joy that had brought Caleb and Winona together at the town dance. As the sun set and the party continued into twilight, Caleb pulled Winona away from the crowd, leading her to the ridge overlooking the valley. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "More than I knew was possible," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "A month ago I thought my life was over because Thomas rejected me. Now I realize he did me the greatest favor imaginable. I should probably send him a thank you note," Caleb said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Do not you dare." She turned in his arms to face him. "I never want to think about Thomas Crawford again. I only want to think about our future, about the life we are going to build together. Then let us talk about that." He brushed a strand of hair from her face with infinite tenderness. "I want children with you. Sons and daughters who inherit your courage and your voice. I want to grow old beside you, arguing and laughing and loving every single day. I want to build something that lasts, not just a ranch or a claim, but a real legacy of standing up for what is right." "That sounds perfect," she whispered. "All of it." They stood together as the stars came out, the sounds of celebration drifting up from below. Tomorrow they would begin their life as husband and wife, facing whatever challenges the territory threw at them. But tonight was for savoring this perfect moment, this absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious. The first years of their marriage unfolded with the kind of busy contentment that comes from shared purpose. They worked hard, combining the ranch and the canyon into a thriving operation. Caleb's knowledge of the mountains and Winona's understanding of cattle management proved to be a formidable combination. Thornton continued to make trouble periodically, but the community solidarity that had formed during the canyon incident held strong. When he tried to challenge Caleb's claim in court, a dozen witnesses testified to the validity of the paperwork and the rancher's prior harassment. The judge, brought in from Santa Fe specifically because he had no ties to local politics, ruled decisively in Caleb's favor. After that, Thornton seemed to lose some of his fire. He was still the biggest rancher in the area, but his power to intimidate had been broken. People had learned they could stand together and win. Jacob lived to see his first grandchild, a son born in the spring of 1880 that they named James after Winona's grandfather. The old man cried when they placed the baby in his arms, tears of joy streaming down his weathered face. "He has your mother's eyes," he told Winona. "She would have been so proud of you, sweetheart, of the woman you have become, the life you have built." "I learned from the best," she said, kissing his cheek. Jacob passed peacefully in his sleep that following winter, sitting in his favorite chair by the window with a book in his lap. They buried him next to Winona's mother on the ridge overlooking the ranch, where the view stretched all the way to the mountains. "He was a good man," Caleb said, his arm around Winona's shoulders as they stood by the grave. "He taught you to speak your mind, to stand up for what is right. That is a legacy worth more than gold." "He would have liked knowing you carried it forward," she replied. "Teaching our children the same values." And they did. James was joined by a daughter 2 years later, Catherine, who inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's steady strength. Then came another son, Michael, who loved the mountains as much as Caleb did. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, how their mother had been rejected for being too outspoken, and their father had said, "Speak your mind always." It became a family motto, a reminder that honesty and courage mattered more than social approval. As the years passed, Caleb and Winona became pillars of the community. Their ranch prospered, but more importantly, they became known as people who could be counted on to do the right thing. When the railroad finally came through in 1888, Caleb negotiated fair terms for all the small ranchers, not just himself. When the school needed a new building, Winona organized fundraising and oversaw construction. Thomas Crawford eventually left Fort Stanton, his land office position eliminated in a scandal involving fraudulent claims. Last anyone heard, he was selling insurance in Denver and was on his third engagement. Sarah Jenkins married Tom Wilson, and they built a happy life on his family's ranch. Mrs. Crawford softened somewhat in her old age, particularly after her son left town in disgrace. She never quite apologized to Winona, but she did tell Catherine once that the girl was lucky to have such a strong mother. Thornton died in 1892, and his empire crumbled quickly thereafter, his children fighting over the inheritance and selling off parcels to pay debts. The Big T Ranch, once so formidable, was divided among several families, including some land that went back to people Thornton had driven out years before. Caleb and Winona celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1898, surrounded by their children and a growing number of grandchildren. James had married a schoolteacher from Santa Fe and had 2 daughters. Catherine was courting a young lawyer who appreciated her strong opinions. Michael, at 16, was still deciding his path, but showed promise as a writer, filling journals with observations about ranch life and the changing territory. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and the family had dispersed, Caleb and Winona sat together on the porch of the canyon cabin, watching the stars emerge against the darkening sky. They spent part of each year here still, loving the peace and isolation even as they maintained the main ranch house. 20 years, Winona mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. Both are true, Caleb said, taking her hand. The gesture was as natural as breathing after 2 decades. I cannot remember my life before you clearly anymore. You have become so essential that the past seems like it belonged to someone else. You ever regret it? Taking on a woman who speaks her mind so freely. It has not always made life easier, he laughed, the sound warm in the gathering darkness. Not for one single second. Winona, you have made me better. Challenged me, supported me, loved me even when I was being stubborn. Speaking your mind has given me the gift of always knowing where I stand with you. There are no games, no hidden resentments, just honesty. We have been lucky, she said softly, to find each other to build this life. Luck had less to do with it than courage, he countered. Your courage to be yourself, even when the whole town was against you. My courage to stand up for what I believed was mine. We found each other because we were both willing to fight for what mattered. She leaned her head on his shoulder, contentment settling over her like a warm blanket. I wonder what Mother would think of how things turned out. I think she would be proud. I think she would see her legacy living on in you and in our children. Speaking truth, standing firm, loving fiercely. Those are the things that matter. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell completely, the canyon alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their activities. An owl called from the pines, hunting. The creek murmured its eternal song. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the rising moon. Caleb. Yes, love, thank you. For what? For seeing me. For valuing the parts of me that others wanted to silence. For building a life where I could be completely myself. He turned to kiss her temple, a gesture of profound tenderness. I should be thanking you for the same thing. We gave each other the greatest gift possible, the freedom to be genuine. As 1900 approached, bringing with it a new century, Caleb and Winona looked toward the future with the same courage that had defined their past. New Mexico was changing, moving toward eventual statehood. The wild frontier was being tamed, though pockets of wildness remained in the mountains and canyons they loved. Their children were building their own lives, carrying forward the values they had been taught. James ran the main ranch with skill and integrity. Catherine had married her lawyer and was making waves in Santa Fe, advocating for women's rights with her mother's fearless voice. Michael's writing was starting to be published, stories of the territory that captured both its beauty and its harsh realities. The grandchildren were growing, a boisterous, beloved collection of personalities. Caleb and Winona delighted in spoiling them, taking them on rides through the canyon, teaching them to track animals, sharing stories of the old days. We are becoming history, Winona observed one day, watching her granddaughters play near the creek. Good history, though, Caleb replied. The kind worth remembering, the kind that teaches important lessons. On their 25th anniversary, the community threw them a celebration. It seemed like half the territory showed up, a testament to the respect and affection they had earned over the years. Pete Martinez, now in his 70s but still spry, played his fiddle. Sarah Wilson brought an elaborate cake. Even the new sheriff, a young man who had heard the stories of the canyon standoff, came to pay his respects. Speech after speech praised their courage, their integrity, their partnership. But the one that mattered most to Winona came from Catherine, standing proud and articulate before the crowd. "My parents taught me that speaking your mind is not a flaw but a virtue," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "They taught me that love means accepting your partner completely, not trying to change them into something more convenient. They showed me that standing up for what is right matters more than social approval. These lessons have shaped my life and the lives of my siblings. They will shape our children's lives in turn. That is the legacy we celebrate today. Not just a successful marriage, but a model of how to live with integrity and courage." Caleb held Winona's hand throughout the speech, his grip tight with emotion. When Catherine finished and returned to her seat, he leaned close and whispered, "We did good, love. We did really good." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. Winona's hair turned silver, though her eyes remained as sharp and her opinions as forthright as ever. Caleb moved a bit slower, his joints protesting the years of hard labor, but his strength was still evident in the way he carried himself. They lost friends to age and accident, celebrated births and weddings, weathered droughts and harsh winters. Through it all, they remained each other's anchor and advocate, the partnership that had begun with a simple assertion that speaking your mind was a virtue. In 1910, on a crisp autumn day with the aspens turning gold in the mountains, they sat together on the porch of the canyon cabin. They were both in their 50s now, well into what would have been considered old age on the frontier, though both remained active and engaged with life. "Do you remember," Winona said, "the day you said you loved me, right here in this canyon, of course. I told you it was too soon, that I should have waited. You said it was not too soon at all. I was right." She smiled at him, the expression lighting up her weathered face. "It was exactly the right time. Everything we have done since has flowed from that moment of absolute honesty. 'Speak your mind always,'" he quoted. "Best advice I ever gave. Best advice I ever took." They watched the sun set over the mountains they had loved for more than 3 decades, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The beauty never grew old, never became routine. Each sunset was a gift, a reminder of the incredible fortune they had found in each other. New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, and Caleb and Winona celebrated with the rest of the territory. Catherine was by then a prominent voice in state politics, advocating for reforms and representing her constituents with the same forthright honesty her parents had modeled. James had expanded the ranch into one of the most respected operations in the state. Michael's books were being read across the country, bringing the story of the territory to people who had never ventured west. As they entered their 60s, Caleb and Winona gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, turning management over to James while they spent more time in the canyon. It was a peaceful transition, both of them content to let the next generation take the lead. They filled their days with simple pleasures, long rides through the mountains, reading together by the fire, visits from children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Their love had deepened over the decades into something profound and unshakable, rooted in mutual respect and absolute honesty. "I have been thinking," Winona said one evening in 1918, as they sat together watching yet another spectacular sunset, "about what we would tell our younger selves if we could go back. What would you say? I would tell myself not to waste a single moment doubting, not to worry about what the town thought or whether I was too outspoken. I would tell myself that the right man would love me for exactly who I was, and to trust that when I found him, I would know." Caleb nodded slowly. "I would tell myself that home is not just a place but a person. That I could search every canyon and valley in the territory, but I would never find what I was looking for until I found you." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "We have been so blessed, Caleb. Not because life was easy, but because we faced it together. With honesty," he added. "Always with honesty." The years continued their march, but Caleb and Winona faced them with the same courage they had shown throughout their lives. When health issues arose, they confronted them directly, making plans and expressing their wishes clearly. When friends and siblings passed, they mourned honestly and helped each other through the grief. Their 70th birthdays were celebrated with grand parties, the family gathering from across the state. By then, the family had grown to include 6 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren, a boisterous, beloved crew that filled the ranch house with noise and laughter. "This," Winona said, surveying the chaos with profound satisfaction, "this is what we built. Not just the ranch or the success, but this family that knows how to love fiercely and speak honestly." Caleb, holding a great-granddaughter who had fallen asleep on his shoulder, nodded. "Our legacy. Better than we could have dreamed." In the summer of 1925, they celebrated their 47th anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them in the canyon cabin. Both were showing their age now, moving more slowly, tiring more easily, but their minds remained sharp and their love as strong as ever. 47 years, Caleb mused. Longer than I ever expected to live when I was a young man in the mountains. Longer than I expected to be this happy, Winona replied. When Thomas rejected me, I thought my chance at love was gone. I could not have imagined finding something so much better. His loss was the making of us both. He raised his glass of wine in a toast, to speaking your mind always. To honesty and courage, she countered, touching her glass to his. They talked late into the night, reminiscing about their years together. The challenges they had faced and overcome. The joys they had shared. The children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. As the candles burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, they held each other close, grateful for every single day they had been given. Caleb passed first, in the spring of 1927, sitting in his favorite chair overlooking the canyon he had fought so hard to claim. He went peacefully, a book in his lap and a smile on his weathered face, simply closing his eyes and not opening them again. Winona found him there, and though her heart shattered, she was grateful he had gone the way he would have wanted, at home, at peace, surrounded by the beauty he loved. She buried him on the ridge above the canyon, where he could watch over the land forever. The entire family gathered for the funeral, along with what seemed like half the state. Person after person spoke of Caleb's integrity, his courage, his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. "He taught me," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "that a man's worth is not measured by what he owns but by how he treats others. That speaking the truth matters more than being comfortable. That love means partnership, not possession. I have tried to live by those principles, and I will teach them to my children and grandchildren in turn." Winona lived another 3 years. Years she spent putting her affairs in order and making sure the family knew all the stories. She wrote them down, filling journal after journal with memories of the life she and Caleb had built together. The story of how they met, how he had said, "Speak your mind always," and changed her life forever. The struggles and triumphs, the love that had sustained them through nearly 50 years. On a crisp autumn morning in 1930, Winona Lewis Young died peacefully in her sleep at the canyon cabin, surrounded by family. She was 73 years old and had lived a life of remarkable courage and conviction. They buried her beside Caleb on the ridge, reuniting them in death as they had been united in life. Catherine, now a respected elder stateswoman, spoke at her mother's funeral. My mother was rejected once for being too outspoken, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. The man who rejected her thought she should be quiet and obedient. But my father saw her truth-telling as the virtue it was. He loved her for her honesty, her courage, her unwillingness to be anything other than herself. Their love story is a lesson for all of us. That the right person will love you for exactly who you are, and that speaking your mind is never something to apologize for. My mother lived that truth every day of her life, and she taught all of us to do the same. The Lewis Young Ranch continued to prosper under family management, each generation adding to the legacy while honoring the principles that had founded it. The canyon remained in the family, a place of retreat and renewal, where grandchildren and great-grandchildren and eventually great-great-grandchildren came to connect with their history. The story of Caleb and Winona became part of local legend, told and retold as an example of frontier courage and enduring love. How she had been rejected for speaking her mind. How he had said those words that changed everything. Speak your mind always. How they had stood together against those who would have silenced or displaced them. How they had built not just a successful ranch, but a family legacy of integrity and honesty. Decades later, when New Mexico celebrated its centennial as a state, Catherine's granddaughter gave a speech about the pioneers who had shaped the territory. She spoke of her great-great-grandparents, Caleb and Winona, and the lessons they had taught. They showed us, she said, that love means accepting your partner completely. That honesty is the foundation of any lasting relationship. That speaking your mind is not a flaw but a strength. That standing up for what is right matters more than social approval or economic advantage. These are not just historical lessons. They are principles that remain vital today in our marriages, our families, our communities. My great-great-grandmother was rejected for being too outspoken. My great-great-grandfather said, "Speak your mind always." That simple exchange of views founded a partnership that lasted nearly 50 years and created a legacy that continues to this day. We honor them by living those same values, by speaking our truths with courage, and by loving with absolute honesty. The Lewis Young family continued to grow and thrive, spreading across New Mexico and beyond. But they remained connected to the canyon and the ranch, to the story of two people who had refused to compromise their integrity and had found in each other the perfect partner. The canyon cabin was preserved as a family heritage site, maintained lovingly across the generations. Couples would go there to reconnect, to remember what mattered. The journals Winona had written were carefully preserved, each generation reading the story of how their ancestors had met and fallen in love, had stood against powerful forces, had built something lasting through honesty and courage. And always, the motto remained, "Speak your mind always." It was inscribed on the family crest, taught to every child, honored in every generation. A simple phrase that had transformed two lives and created a legacy that would endure for as long as the mountains stood and the creek ran clear through Little Creek Canyon. In the end, Caleb and Winona's story was one of perfect simplicity. Two people who refused to be anything other than themselves, who found in each other absolute acceptance and enduring love, who spoke their minds always and built a life of remarkable integrity on that foundation, who stood against injustice and won through courage and community, who loved fiercely and honestly for nearly 50 years, who left behind not just property and prosperity but a family and a community transformed by their example. It was the kind of love story the West was built on, hard-earned, honestly won, and lasting long after those who lived it had passed into legend. And in the canyon where Caleb had first claimed his home, where Winona had stood beside him against those who would drive him out, where they had built their life together. The wind still sang through the pines, and the creek still ran clear and cold, eternal testimony to a love that had conquered every obstacle through the simple power of absolute honesty and unwavering courage.